Program Budgeting, Margin Analysis. Wonderful title. Thanks ever so much for letting me talk to this. I've had a lot of fun looking at definitions of hell and reflecting on hell and hellish decisions. I see my role really as warming you up for the more intellectual discussions which are happening later today and later in this program. I'll leave it to clever people to come up with the techie side of this. But I'd like to take you through really reflections on personal journey through some of this and see how that chimes with your experience and most importantly where we go next with all of this. Local Oxford academic reflecting on evil and hell, making the point that evil can be generated by quietly spoken men in white collars in rooms. You know, evil from which hell generates can be proposed and seconded and carried and minuted, he makes the point. So his symbol for hell would be a police state or a thoroughly nasty business concern. That's not the NHS, is it? I certainly hope. What's a decision? Well, a decision is a choice you make when the way forward is not self-evident. Decisions have to have values in. Decisions need to have wisdom, they need to have experience. Trish Greenhalgh, I noticed in a BMJ a few months ago. Have you read her article on that? If you like, the godmother of evidence-based medicine is increasingly recanting or retracting from her stance to say that we really need to bring other things to bear when we make decisions. The evidence takes us so far, but we can't ignore the value of intuition and experience and just sheer wisdom. What's a hellish decision? I pondered that for a while. I think it's one that clashes with your personal values, or you're forced to make a choice and you know it's going to hurt you or it's going to hurt someone else. Anyway, try a decision. I was worried for a moment that you were going to take us down this slide. If we had more room, I'd get you to stand in different parts of the room, but we haven't got the room, we haven't got the time. So just by a show of hands, please. If you were the decision taker for the cancer programme budget for next year, which is typically about 40 million for a CCG cluster, the budget's fixed, but it is up to you to be flexible to spend it in new ways next year. So I'll ask you A, B and C whether you would like to spend a greater proportion of that fixed budget on prevention, whether you'd like to spend a greater proportion on diagnostics and treatment aimed at cure, or whether you would like to spend more of it on supportive care, giving people a good death, looking after their carers while they are living with this increasingly chronic problem of cancer, from which they may not necessarily die. They may die with their cancer, they may not necessarily die of their cancer. So I hope that's enough thinking time. Just quickly, just for fun, and you can do this from a visceral level as well as a cerebral level. How many of you would vote for spending more of the budget on prevention? Big hands up in the air. That's almost universal, that's interesting. How many of you would spend it on B? There are a few, okay, and how many would spend it on C? Quite a significant number, maybe a third of you there. Okay, so I hope none of you cheated and put your hands up more than once. First off, there isn't unanimity in the room, so clearly people are bringing their own experience and values to this. I didn't give you a scrap of evidence on which to base your decision, but thank you for committing yourselves. Okay, that was the easy decision. Here comes the hellish one. It was a fixed budget. All right, you can't spend more in one area, and you all committed yourselves, thank you. You've now got to decide where you're going to take it from, okay? You need a little bit longer to think about that, but I'm going to ask you to vote in a minute. Clearly, if you voted more for prevention, you can't now vote to take it out of prevention, all right? You've got to take it from one of the other two. So just ponder that for a moment. I won't be mean to you and ask you to write the press statement which explains your second decision. That's my world, and you're welcome to it. Sorry, and you're welcome to it. But okay, ready, shall we go? How many would take it out of prevention? A few, interesting. How many would take it out of diagnosis and treatment? That's about half-ish. And how many would take it out of supportive care for patients and carers? Yeah, a number, okay. And how many would go for D? I gave you a D option this time, and we've got 1, 2, 3, Yeah, we've got some abstentions this time. I can't
No
afford
lunch.
it.
No lunch for abstention.
Yeah. I'm coming to that, right. That wasn't much fun, was it? We have to try and think, well, what would make those sorts of hellish decisions when they're saying no decision's better? Well, clearly it would help us, wouldn't it, to have more evidence on what the options are for those disinvestments. What do we know about the effectiveness of where we've taken it from and where we were planning to put it to, etc. So what do we know about what the public think? Let's get some of those things out there. So it would help to have a lot more around that. I don't mean to be mean to any of you in Group D, but and there may be very valid reasons why you're in that group, but let me just give you this definition from Kennedy. Trouble is, we can't dodge these decisions, can we? Someone needs to make these decisions, and the question is, do those of us with a clinical background, or those with an NHS background, whatever our background, are we prepared to front up and stand up and say, I'm prepared to make this decision in all honesty and openness, these are the trade-offs I've come up with, this is what I'm thinking we're doing, or are we going to leave it to someone else? Because I tell you, for those of us who are clinically qualified, if we don't step up and make these decisions and leave it to managers or politicians, local authority elected members, then some idiot may make the wrong decision. Sorry, did I say idiot out loud? I didn't mean to use intemperate language, I'm sorry. I meant to say bastard. How can we take some heat then out of the hellish decisions? Instead of heat, can we bring some light to it? And so 3 things about clarity. Clarity, let's bring some light to this. Can we, and this is the burden that is felt, I think, by public health doctors, but anyone who has an interest in improving health of populations and using money responsibly. And I think by that definition, that's everybody in this room, whatever it says on your badge. But we had greater clarity about what the needs were, the resources were, the opportunities and the constraints, a clarity of purpose between ourselves. And if you want to understand commissioning, to say it slowly, it's about a shared mission between all the different parties. And if there was a greater clarity and perhaps some greater honesty about the trade-offs when resources were being increased or decreased, or just simply redeployed in new ways, we would be able to take some of the heat out of it. But of course you can't take it all out. That's why I've been interested in the whole area of programme budgets and marginal analysis, which is simply about trying to align these very complex decisions into a series of manageable and meaningful programmes, which might be by disease group, it might be by age group, it might be by geographical setting, whatever is meaningful and relevant for that purpose. Agree what you're trying to do first. What are we for? Long before you start looking at the money and the resources, but what is it for? Then identify the resources, which include not just the money, but time and commitment and the voluntary sector and all that sort of stuff. What's being brought to bear? Increasingly now, I think we should stop being patronising and say to the population, what do we need? The first question is, what can you do? Second question is, how can I help? We should be giving people a hand up instead of a hand out. Genuinely empowering them and involving them and helping them accept responsibility for the outcome as well. Okay, the resources, which include the assets of the community as well as the resources we bring to the table in finance. And then we appraise how we could shift resource around and what the costs and benefits of that would be. Because so much of the decision is value-laden, it is important we consult before we actually make or take the decision, implement the decision, but then we've got to make it happen, and then we ought to evaluate and share the learning. That last one is often neglected. Way back when I was sort of tinkering with this and trying to make sense of what I'd been given as a brand new consultant to do, and you has reminded you that I was working alongside an equally fresh-faced person called Simon Stevens at the time. And I really must ask him how he's got on with this thinking. But we did some work and we wrote it up, and I think those underlying purposes, principles, whatever you want to call them, still apply today. I still think that it's quite helpful in something as complex as for all these different diseases and all these different comorbidities and all these different age groups, is just to simplify it down into a manageable set of programs, and then you're informed, then you can plan, then you can coordinate, and it really helps in communicating. Very difficult to ask the public to be meaningfully engaged with us in where the priorities should lie, unless you've told them, well, here is how much we currently spend. Even as late as 2010, when I arrived in Croydon for my last DPH post within the NHS, I sat down and I asked the CCG, just for a show of hands, this is the, sorry, not the CCG, it was the Primary Care Trust at the time, a mixture of executive and non-executives. Quick show of hands, does Croydon spend more on which of the big three? Does it spend more on mental health or heart disease or cancers? And hands went up in each three category, and I said, well, it's mental health, they said that's interesting, and I said, it's nearly as much on mental health as the other two put together, and they said, oh, really? And then my question to them, so what was the return on your investment? You've been running this for years, I've just arrived, and of course they'd never asked the question. So just getting ballpark figures, phrasing your questions can be quite helpful in terms of communicating, and we've got to communicate in order to move on. Briefly then, doing this for real now, I have made a personal pledge not to be a salaried employee of these big bureaucracies again. I just found it too difficult on a personal level. So I'm now a freelancer, and I should make that clear. I'm just an interim, 3 days a week in Gloucestershire, and happy to do that. And I won't be doing that on a permanent basis, but I'll probably be there for a couple of years. But I've been parachuted into a department which had inherited a £22 million grant to deploy on public health activities. They've really been through the mill in terms of reorganisation, losing a lot of valued colleagues, being downsized and placed in a slightly alien and unfamiliar environment. And they had inherited 16 programmes of activity, and they were busy and almost overwhelmed trying to deliver them. So one of the first things we did was sit down and say, well, let's not agonise about how difficult it is to spend 22 million. Let's just imagine we were starting with a blank sheet of paper. It was ours to spend. What would we like to do? What do we think is important? And we got the programmes down to 9 core programmes, supporting the CCG, getting a joint strategic needs assessment done, developing a health and wellbeing board, a couple of major commissioning of public health services, etc., etc. But we got it down to 9. We also felt it was important to be able to describe our activities in the different age groups. So we have 0 to 4-year-olds, 5 to 19-year-olds as 2 children-related ones, and then there's 2 working age programmes, and then there's 2 older people's programmes. So as we begin to map our resources into our different programmes, can you picture in your mind a matrix? So the rows, which are the 9 public health programmes, will add up to 22 million, or you can add up what we're spending on each age group, and that will come to 22 million. So that's how it does. And so we've got a sort of rough order of magnitude of where the money's going, and then are we happy with that distribution? I can tell you now, we have inherited a pattern of spending which is very working age orientated, and we're quite keen to start shifting it out of the way. We just happen to have inherited a lot of responsibility for health checks, sexual health, substance misuse, and it tends to be for working age people. So that's what we're doing. We're defining each programme's purpose and objectives in very short terms, as well as a longer explanation. You need to be able to explain to your cabinet member for public health at the local authority, the chief executive when you're going up in the lift, to yourself when you're sitting at your desk. Just a quick sentence, what was this programme for? As well as some more detailed measurable objectives. We are now planning future resource in three scenarios that we have been given. One is steady state, which we anticipate next 2 years, then a 10% cut in April 16 and a further 10% cut in April 17. And we are just now, as a thought experiment, collectively saying, how do we think we would take money out of this matrix with least adverse impact? And here's the thing, it's not about what you cut, and therefore you're just left with a subset of what you used to do. It's refreshing, how would you now spend the sum that you do have? I think I've said all of that. So these are things which are to be done, and then this bottom one is being done qualitatively across the board, and then hopefully quantitatively in some of the bigger hitting areas where we need a much more formal business case. And we're on a tight time scale. We don't have time to muck about with this, we just got to get on with it. Very similar sort of activity going on in the CCG. I have to pay tribute to Kirsty Alexander here, a predecessor in public health, who really brought programme budgeting alive and made it live in GP land in Gloucestershire. And I can tell you it's alive and well, and it's got considerable momentum around it. The GPs are thinking very creatively about how to better deploy the current resource in circulation or diabetes or mental health. And they're thinking some really quite innovative ways of spending it, really shifting it to the community setting, really getting involved in helping people help themselves, empowering individuals and communities. So, PBMA will help you take the heat out, but it doesn't make decisions for you. I am not for 1 minute suggesting that this is a decision-making tool. This is a decision support tool. So, what else do we need? I think fairly self-evident this, but we certainly need better evidence on epidemiology, economic, published and narrative evidence. The one deficiency, I would say, in our GP land, and I think across the country, is a relative paucity of narrative evidence in the needs assessment. We tend to do a needs assessment in epidemiological and economic terms. We forget to ask the people who use the service, care for people and provide the service, what do you think the needs are? Your intention is explicit values, because we talk about values here. Some which have come up from the GPs is they definitely value early intervention and are determined to demonstrate that they have shifted resource and energy upstream, building personal resilience and being proactive rather than reactive on older people's care. They have an aspiration that everyone who's on their books over a certain age want to have an active plan and be actively managed. We won't just wait for them to fall ill and come and hit the service. And these sort of values, these really would help if we had a bit more honesty, humility, courage, visibility and credibility, including with the press. So let me give you some of the sort of stuff you get. This is some experience from Norwich. It's actually part of a much longer story, but I'll just give you 2 quick slides from this one. Our interrelationship with the press began on a sour note, which was this quote from the local diabetologist: PCTs are taking a health economics approach, trying to reduce expenditure when they should take a more humanitarian approach. But it was an opportunity to open a new discussion. So this is actually a favourable occasion to start that dialogue with the local press about, hey, look, we've got resources, we've got needs, we've got to try and balance the two. So my response at that time, having previously checked it with the diabetologist, was along these lines. You can read it for yourself, but the stuff in there about health economics is not about making economies, it's about being clear where the money goes and what good it does. We're trying to get the best health outcomes from the money. What do your readers think? I haven't brought all that correspondence with me today, that's for another session another time, but we've got 5 readers' letters with the various views, we've got further correspondence from practicing clinicians, we've got a discussion going about whether we should take the money out of mental health and put it into diabetes. But at the end of the day, the decision was to take some money out of test strips and put it into diabetes liaison nurses, and also save some money. Moving on though, that sort of opened the floodgates to a really robust and I thought quite lively debate about spend and outcome, spend and resources. So here was one from February 2006 about spending more money upstream instead of downstream. Here was a discussion about spending more on hospital infection because we now had comparative data through programme budgeting to show that we weren't spending as much as others and we had a bigger problem. Here was one on mental health. This was about spending too much in an area. I can tell you 2 years later, antidepressant prescribing costs in Norwich had fallen by 30%, with support from the local population. And this was a really interesting one. Remember the Herceptin outbreak, controversy. NICE said we should use Herceptin. People said, we weren't spending enough. Interestingly, while every other local paper in the country that covered this generally had the picture of a woman with breast cancer who didn't have Herceptin, our local press went with a man with the brain tumour who hadn't had his MRI scan because the money had been spent on Herceptin. It's a really interesting acceptance that there were some difficult decisions to make. They didn't call it hellish decisions, they call it doctors face a quandary on who to treat. They began to understand the dilemma. And this was far from resolving all the difficulties, but at least the dialogue was going. And I really wish we could go back to those days. It was really quite hard to sustain this. And in a later incarnation, in another PC, I got into real trouble for even opening up a discussion with the press. And a lovely quote from the B&J from the same local cancer service. Political pressure, patient advocacy, and media hyperbole should not determine who is treated and what they're treated with. Quite right. Okay, just one slide, this one and the next couple on an area of Hellish decisions. I'll just mention it and then move on. But just in case anyone else in the room is facing this as well, sometimes the Hellish decision is when to stay and confront what you see as safety and probity issues, when to take the next step and actually escalate it to an approved regulator, and do, for goodness sake, follow due process when you do that, if you do. And when to say, well, this is not for me, I'm going to walk away. I've resigned 3 times. What we really want to do is get back to the patient, and I'm really glad that the earlier conversation was getting back to that. That's what really matters. And slightly for fun, I asked the question, what kind of doctors do we want? And I looked to W.H. Auden's famous poem of what he wanted from his doctor. Give me a doctor, partridge plump, short in the leg and broad in the rump, an endomorph with gentle hands who'll never make absurd demands that I abandon all my vices, nor pull a long face in a crisis, but with a twinkle in his eye, will tell me that I have to die. So that's one way of managing hellish decisions, in a sympathetic, caring way. There was a lovely parody of this by a London GP called Maria Clampkin, and this is hers. This is tongue-in-cheek, I'm sure. Give me a doctor underweight, computerised and up-to-date, a businessman who understands accountancy and target bands, who demonstrates extreme devotion to audit and to health promotion, but when my hat looks for the worst, refers me to the practice. And I couldn't resist having a go myself. So this is a public health economist's view. I want someone who'll be sympathetic. I want them to be knowledgeable, but I want them to understand the system, but I don't want any more than what I'm entitled to. So mine would be like this. I want a doctor worldly wise with a kindly face and honest eyes, but an advocate who'll understand not only what the rules demand, but where I fit within the scheme and mobilise the wider team to make provision for my care, but no more than my care. And I really mean that quite sincerely. Don't give me anything. And I'll finish on this note, it's self-evident. Good news, guys, about decision making. Do like decision making. End of. Thank you.